Good evening, gentlemen.
We are in the middle of chapter 4 of the second part of the Tanya. We are in the middle of a discussion. We're trying to answer the Alter Rebbe's question at the beginning of chapter 3. God willing, today, if we go a little overtime to make up for the time we've lost, we can answer the question. So it's a good time for those returning to us to return, because we're going to ask a question and we're going to answer it. The question that was asked at the end of chapter 3 is...
Got the first part.
The question at the end of chapter 3, is if the world is totally united with the divine power that God puts into it, and He is speaking the world into existence at every moment, and there is no aspect of the world whatsoever that exists apart from the divine speech by which He is creating it at every moment, from nothing into something, then how is it that we do not see the godliness that is in the world around us? It's a mimah nafshach. It's a either way, right? If godliness and the world are as united as the Alter Rebbe says, if the world truly has no existence beyond, outside of its source in the divine speech, like the ray of the sun in the sun, right? That the ray of the sun within the sun is really just a part of the sun. It's a way of the sun's being. So too the world is a way of being of the godly speech which speaks it into existence. And the world exists within its source. And there is no aspect, there is no quality of form or matter that exists beyond the divine speech which is speaking it into existence. How is it that we see the table but we do not see the divine speech? Because the table is the divine speech. The table is nothing other than the divine speech. There is nothing to the table other than divine speech, if it is created from nothing into something, as we explained at great length in chapters 1 and chapter 2. Chapters 1 and 2. So if there is nothing to the world other than the divine speech which is constantly creating it, why do we not see God within the world? When we look at the table, we do not see the divine speech of Shulchan, of God speaking it into existence at every moment. On the other hand, if we do not see the divine speech, then we should not be able to see the table, because there is nothing to the table which exists beyond the divine speech. So what is it exactly that we are seeing is really the question. We know that the table has no existence beyond the divine speech. So why is it that when we look at the table, we see something that appears to be an independent reality that is not divine and is not an expression of godliness at all? That was the question at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is answering this question, and the answer in short is Shemesh u'Magen Hashem Elokim. That Havaya and Elokim are two names of God, describing two things that God does. And the two things that God does are like the sun and the sheath around the sun. The shield around the sun, which limits its rays, which limits its radiance. There is the sun, which emanates heat, and there is a shield around the sun, as we will read on Rashi at the beginning of next week's Parsha, God willing. There is a shield around the sun, a sheath, a nartik, right, a magen, which prevents the sun from scorching the earth. So too is God's name Havaya and God's name Elokim. There are two things that God does. Two things that God does. One is an expression, and one is the prevention or the limitation of that expression. Havaya, the four-letter name of God, Yud, K, and Vav, and K, is the godly expression, or the godly kindness. It is the divine life source, the divine expression, which constantly creates everything from something into nothing. In other words, what we have been describing in chapters 1, 2, and 3, of God speaking the world into existence, would appear to be Shem Havaya. Shem Havaya, God creating things, something from nothing. And that is why, we explained in this chapter, it is spelled Havaya, Yud, He, Vav, He, because He, Vav, He spells Hove, which means to be, is, and Yud means does it in the present tense and constantly. So Yud Heve means he is always making things be. And that's why he's called by his four-letter name. This describes God as he is always making things be, creating the world something from nothing. Shem Elokim, on the other hand, is the sheath, is the limitation, the self-limitation of this process. And the answer to the question in chapter 3, why can we not see the divine speech within all worldly realities? Why do we not see the world as divine? The answer is Shem Elokim. Shem Elokim is the answer. God is concealing himself. There is a divine function of self-concealment. And that is what we are going to be talking about today, the divine function of self-concealment. But before we do that, we have one more piece of our review, which is what we spoke about last week. Last week we spoke about the absolute inability of the creation to understand Shem Havaya. The Alter Rebbe says that God's creation from nothing into something is completely beyond human understanding. And at three levels, we said at the end of last week's class. In three ways is it totally beyond our understanding. First of all, creating ex nihilo, creating something from nothing, is not a process which exists in our experience, which is one reason we can't understand it, because we only really, as human beings, understand things that are in our own experience, that we have direct experience of. And we don't have any direct experience in human life of creating something from nothing. Then we said, even beyond this, the creation of something from nothing is actually beyond our intellectual grasp. It is a notion that is beyond comprehension. Nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe goes even a level further, and he says we don't understand it because it's one with God, which is really a categorical difference, as we explained at the end of last week's class. Because for something to be beyond understanding could mean that it is a very deep or very difficult to understand idea, and we are not able to grasp it, like a child trying to understand something very complicated that only a smart adult can understand, right? Like a small child trying to understand advanced science or advanced math, something like that, very difficult to grasp.
Or the other way around. It is so simple that we don't understand, we see it. And I'm going to give you an example that I heard. Like 2 drops of water in the ocean are laugh and half. Ocean doesn't exist because we don't see the ocean. They are already in the ocean. From the outside, obviously you can see the ocean. So maybe we see God, but we don't understand that we see it.
Everything is God. The question is, the reason why God is concealed is not because of our lack of understanding. That's not what the Alter Rebbe is saying. But one second, I haven't got to that yet. This isn't talking about this isn't talking about why we can't experience it. It's talking about why it is totally beyond, but why it is actually impossible to understand. You understand the difference? Not that we practically don't understand it. This is actually the point I was making. That at one level, it's something which is beyond understanding, which whatever that means, you can explain it. It's too simple, it's too complicated. However you want to explain it, it's beyond understanding. But then there's a third level. The third level is that Shem Havaya is not just a very difficult idea to understand, but it is actually one with God. And just as we can't understand God, we can't understand this, which is really an even further level. Because, as I was trying to say before, if there is an idea that you can't understand, that's like a small child trying to understand a difficult subject, maybe. There's an idea, but the idea is beyond my understanding. But God is not an idea. God is not an idea. That's what we finished with discussing in last week's class. God is not something that is understandable. God is not something which can be comprehended. It's a category error. The way the Alter Rebbe says it in a different part of Tanya, as I said in last week's class, is that it's saying God is beyond understanding is like saying an idea is so deep that you can't grasp it with your hands. right? The point being that the reason you can't grasp an idea with your hands is not because it's a deep idea, it's because ideas and hands don't go together. It's a totally different plane of reality, a totally different dimension. There's no interaction, right? So too, with God and human understanding, and any understanding. God is not an understandable thing. He is in a totally different category. He is not an idea, right?
Yet he makes himself see in a certain situation, like in the Matan Torah, like when they went in the desert, so Amud Anan, Amud Esh. So he chooses, how to appear.
God is not the pillar of fire or the cloud. That's not God.
But this was, a reflection of him somehow.
There's many things there. The Sefer Torah is a reflection of him. But the thing is that is not God himself. The Torah is a Torah. It's not God himself, right?
Is there another way to express it that might be an easier lay expression that we can comprehend, we can experience we can experience the concept that God exists, but we can no way appreciate or comprehend the reality of God.
I think we mentioned that last week, right? In other words, we have some sense of the concept of God as apart from other concepts, and really that's what we're constantly refining as we learn about God. But that doesn't mean we experience God as we experience ourselves or things that are within human comprehension per se, right?
But the existence of God is part of the emunah. Some people may say God doesn't exist, some people say God exists. I feel it. But still it's a part of trust and emunah.
Is the feeling that God exists God himself?
No, I read it. Some people, no.
Let me tell you.
Don't feel it, that means God doesn't exist.
Let me tell you what I think of when I see these three levels. Right. The first level is, right. There's an idea. Let's put it like this. There's an idea which can be understood by a human being. There's an idea which cannot be understood by a human being, and then there's a God. And Shem Havaya is a name of God. In other words, we're saying, the Alter Rebbe says, the name is one with him. The nature of that unity we'll discuss more later. Much later, it doesn't matter now. But the name is one with him, right? And that's why, he's saying that's why we can't understand it. Not because it's so deep that it's beyond comprehension. It's not a thing to be comprehended. So when the Alter Rebbe says that, this is what I think of, right? I think of what we say when we discuss the miracle that was in the Beis HaMikdash, that the Makom Ha'aron Enoi Min Amida, right? We say, where is God himself expressed on earth? Between the poles of the ark that stood in the temple. And how did we know that God himself was expressed there? Because the place of the Aron could not be measured, right? We've mentioned this before in this class. But really, with regards to the space of the Aron can't be measured, there's three levels. And I'm not just saying this because I think it explains the previous topic. I think this is vital to tonight's class as well. There's three levels in what it means that the Aron doesn't take up space. Well, what am I talking about, first of all, just to remind everyone? The Aron didn't take up space. It said you would measure the Aron, and it would be a certain measure, and then you would measure the room from each side of the Aron, and you would see that the Aron took up no space. In other words, you would measure the ark, and it would be 2.5 cubits, and the room was 10 cubits, but you would measure from each end of the Aron to the walls, and you would add it together, and you would see that it's 10 cubits. It didn't take up space. You could measure it, and it took up space, but it also didn't take up space, right, in the room. That's what it says in the Gemara, okay? The space of the Aron was not measurable, is one way of putting it, right? Well, what does this mean? There's three parts, right? There's three aspects. I think this is a good way of thinking about that. What does it mean God is not an idea to be understood, right? There's three things. The first thing is measure, right? Is measuring things. Measuring things is nature, natural. Right? Measuring things is natural. Things take up a certain amount of space. Nature itself is defined by space. Space and time is basically the basic definition of the realm of nature. The place where things have rules and they follow the rules and they make sense and everything works within a system. Right? Nature. Things are measurable. Then there's something beyond nature. The thing beyond nature is called a nes, a miracle. Right? What is the miracle? The miracle is that God can break nature at will. So for example, you have a rule that water lies flat, and God makes a miracle that it stands like a wall. right? For example. Or you have a stick, and the stick turns into a snake. Sticks don't turn into snakes, right? It's against the rules. There's no reason why this should happen. Now here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. I do not understand how it is that God turns the stick into the snake. Yes? However, what I do understand is what a stick is, what a snake is, and that one has turned into the other. In other words, I understand enough about nature, about the measure, to realize that nature is being destroyed, even though I do not understand the nature of that destruction. I don't understand the nature is a confusing word. I don't understand the way that happens. I don't understand. There is no process, is the point, right? A miracle means there is no process. Process is nature. A miracle means no process. This thing was one way, now it's a different way. How did God do this? There is no how, right? That's what makes him God. Things within nature need a how. God doesn't need a how, right? So you have nature and you have a miracle. Nature we can understand. A miracle is like the idea that we can't understand, right? It is within the realm of intellect, meaning I can point at what is being done here. There is something that is being done here, and there is a notion to it. A stick turns into a snake. Yes? There is something which takes place here. The only thing is that there's a hole in the middle. There's something missing, right? There's a fundamental aspect here which points toward God, because this doesn't follow the rules, right? There's an aspect beyond which I cannot understand. So it's almost like I understand what I don't understand. Yes? What's called Yedias HaShlila, knowing through negation, right? I know what I don't know. Right? Why do I know what I don't know? Because I understand what a stick is. I understand what a snake is. And I know that a stick doesn't naturally turn into a snake. And I know that I don't know how one can turn into the other. Right? That's what makes it a miracle. In terms of the emotional impact, that's the point. The point is, God reveals that what you think is a solid rule of reality is not a rule. Yes? So we understand that we don't understand, is the miracle. So there's something you can understand, which is nature. There's something which is beyond understanding, but you understand what you don't understand, which is a miracle. The makim ha'aron ena min amida, that the place of the aron is without measure, is not a miracle. It's also not natural, obviously. It's not nature, which is obvious, but it's also not a miracle. It's not a miracle that the space of the aron is without space, and I'll prove it to you. The whole point of this idea that the space of the aron is without space is not that a miracle is taking place, because nature in this case would be the ark has a measure like everything else, right? Miracle would be the ark does not have a measure, right? I can't measure it.
You see it, but you cannot measure it.
No. In other words, I can measure it, but it doesn't have a measure. In other words, it doesn't take up space.
Like the stick to the snake.
But if you can measure what the numbers would disappear.
No, not the numbers would disappear. In other words, I measure it and it's 2.5 cubits, and then I measure the room, and then then I see that there's no measure, right? But that's not what's taking place. The miracle would be that there's no measure at all, right?
What does that mean again?
Pardon?
There's no measure
That the aron doesn't take up space. I would measure from one side of the room to the aron and the other side of the room to the aron and find that it takes up no space. So the room is 10 cubits wide, and I measure to the left side and I measure to the right side, and it's 5 and 5. And yet there's this thing in the middle. It takes up no space.
number 3 right away.
So it adds a measure. By mathematics, it's like there's no measure.
He's saying it jumps to number 3.
I'm saying it takes up no space. It takes up no space.
Because of the mathematics. But when you come to the Aron Kodesh, you measure it, and it does have a measure.
The whole notion is nonsensical, which is kind of my point. But anyway, let's not try to imagine how you could actually do it, because the whole point is that it's beyond imagining. It's completely illogical. That's the whole point, right? So what's happening here is not a miracle. Why is it not a miracle? I'll explain it to you. Because the entire reason why the aron is the aron, and therefore this miracle takes place, is that the aron is of a certain measure. In other words, if someone came, God forbid, with some sort of a hacksaw and cut off half a cubit from the left side of the Aron, would this occurrence of the space of the Aron taking up no space happen? And the answer is no, because everything in the Beis HaMikdash is built with extreme precision to precise measures as dictated by the Torah. You take this box, which is made in a very precise way, and you put it in a very precise place. Yes? And because it is a very precise box with a very specific measure of however many cubits, and you put it exactly in the middle of the room, because all the measures are exact, it therefore has no measure. If it were to actually have no measure, then it would have a measure. You see what I'm saying? If it were to have the incorrect measure, it would have a measure when you measured it, when you measured the room. It would take up space. The only reason why there is no measure, why it does not take up space, is because it takes up space. It is the taking up space in the precise and specific way that it does that makes it take up no space. Right? Which is a contradiction. It's a logical contradiction, and that's the point. That's what it's meant to be. It's a logical contradiction. In other words, we cannot even really understand, if you try and picture it, what it was like to actually see the Aron in the Aron Kodesh. It is not something to be understood. Nature you can understand. A miracle is beyond understanding. But God is not a thing which is beyond understanding. He's not a thing that is within the realm of understanding at all. It's literally a contradiction. The expression of God on earth is a contradiction. It's saying that the mind has limits and the limits are here. This is not a miracle which breaks your assumptions and breaks what you think is possible. You actually have no idea what this is. It's not, oh look, the rules of nature are being broken, because the rules of nature are not being broken and being broken simultaneously. The rules of nature are not being broken. The Aron takes up 2.5 cubits and must. And yet the rules of nature are being broken because they're not being broken. The whole idea is that that God is not an idea which can be grasped intellectually. The mind cannot grasp God, which is why when he expresses on earth, in the holiest place on earth, in the holiest in the holy ark, how does it express? As a contradiction. It's not
simultaneous realities that are not the same.
It's a contradiction. It's a logical contradiction. A is not A, you would say.
Simultaneously, you have realities that are not the same. You have something with a measure.
Exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's like saying a square circle, right? Or as all the examples the philosophers would have. It's like saying a person is writing and not writing at the same time. Or A is not A, you would say in algebra, right? It's literally a contradiction. It takes up space because it doesn't take up space. Logical contradiction. And that's the point. So it's what?
It's like Earth.
What do you mean?
It doesn't take up space. Where does it take up space?
I'm not sure what you mean.
In space.
I don't know what that means, but I have to move on. We have a lot to cover. That's the idea. The idea is that God is not something which can be ascertained intellectually. God is not on the plane of intellect. The intellect ends. There is nothing here to be understood. It's a contradiction. The mind cannot grasp it. It cannot be fathomed. We cannot even say really what took place there. In other words, you cannot actually intellectually say when you were to look at the Aron and if you were to look at the Aron and were to measure it, you could not even really say what you were seeing. The description that the Gemara gives, if you look at it too closely, falls apart in contradiction, which is why I encourage you not to get into it too deeply, because it doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. Yes, the way the Rebbe understands the miracle of Hanukkah was another such example. That the oil was being consumed by the fire, and it was specifically because it was being consumed in a non-miraculous way that the miracle happened. The only reason the miracle of Hanukkah happened is because they specifically did it in a way that they were not relying on a miracle. That's a discussion for a different time. Maybe when Hanukkah rolls around.
Yes, but I mean in a different perspective.
So that's another example. And it sounds a lot like the burning bush as well, although in the Rebbe's Sikha, where he talks about the Hanukkah candles, he says the burning bush is different. The Hanukkah candles we know for sure. The burning bush maybe not. The Hanukkah candle is another example. But anyway, so that's what I think of to explain or to get a handle on this idea that God is not an idea. God is not an idea. A miracle is something which is an idea that is beyond understanding. The Makam Aron Ena Min Amida is not an idea. It's not something that can be understood fundamentally. It is from outside of the realm of intellect.
Before you go,
Yeah.
the burning bush.
Yes, sir.
That is within the realm of understanding, or is not?
The way the Rebbe reads it in the Sikha, the point is not on the miracle side, the point is on the nature side. Whether it depends how you read it, bottom line, right? Because when we say the bush is burning and is not consumed, right, you could read it in this way, that the burning is specifically by nature a natural act of consumption, and that is what is making it burn, and yet it is specifically because it is burning, right, that it is not consumed. It is specifically because the fire is burning it that makes it not consumed, and you could create the same thing again. But I believe that what the Rebbe says in that Sikha is that it's not clear whether that's actually what was happening. It could be just a regular miracle. In other words, not caused because of the nature of the fire and of the bush. It could just be a straight breaking of nature, like a stick turning into a snake, for example. But we can learn that Sikha at a different time, God willing. So let's go further in the text here. We are on page 864 in the English. So long story short, you can't understand Shem Havaya. You cannot understand God as He is the creator, the constant creator of something from nothing. First line on page 864 in the Hebrew, Kach mamash ein beyachote lahasig in the Hebrew. Everyone with me? Kach mamash, so too literally. Ein beyachote lahasig. It is we are not able to understand midas gvurasei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The gvura, the might, also translated as restraint, as we learned in that Gemara one week, I think it was last week. Shehi midas hatzimtzum umanias hispashtos hachayis migdulase, which is the tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means contraction, limitation, the restraining of the extension of life from his trait of chesed, from Havaya. What is Gvura? What is Elokim? It is the limitation of this expression. Shem Havaya is an expression. It expresses God. What is the expression of godliness? To constantly create things, something from nothing. Gvura is the limitation. Gvura is the limitation, the restraint, him holding himself back in this process. We are going to discuss more what this means in a moment. So tzimtzum is a contraction. Yes? Tzimtzum, like for example, if you were to, what's it called? When you think of tzimtzum, you could think of a couple of different things, but one thing you could think of is almost like a camera aperture, right? It's a tzimtzum. You limit the amount of light that passes through the lens, right? It closes, it opens, right? Tzimtzum is a limitation of the light that passes through. You could also think, there's different types of tzimtzumim. You could also think of a lampshade, or a curtain, like a gauzy curtain, which doesn't make the hole smaller, but rather reduces the power of the light. There's, I'm not sure, but there's all different things. The point is, what it's holding the light back, one way or another. It's limiting the expression of the light, or it's diminishing the light, not through a smaller aperture, but through things that get in the way, the mesech, as it's called, the screen. The different things that limit the expression of the light, filter the light, yes, exactly. This is his gevura. His gevura, Shem Elokim, the other name of God that we are discussing, refers to God in his capacity of holding back, filtering, diminishing, restraining that light, that expression, the expression of creating everything something from nothing. What is he prevented from doing? He prevents it from descending and being revealed or experienced by the creation, to give them life and make them be in a revealed way, in a way that they can experience. Ki im behester panim. Rather, what does it do? It conceals, hester panim, literally it hides his face. It conceals this reality. So in other words, what is Shem Elokim doing? Right? Because we're saying it's a limitation on Shem Havaya. Right? It's a limitation on God's creating something from nothing. Does that mean he doesn't create something from nothing? God forbid. Right? Everything that we said in the first 3 chapters is true. God creates something from nothing. Not only does he create something from nothing, he does it at every moment. And if he were to cease doing it, everything would return to absolute nothingness. And the existence of the thing that is created is within its source, is within the power that creates it constantly from something to nothing. And it has no reality apart from that godly power, which creates it something from nothing. What does Shem Elokim do? Shem Elokim prevents the creation from experiencing this fact. Shem Elokim takes the table, which is really the entire reality of the table is God's speech, which is constantly being spoken, speaking the table into existence. That's all that's here. And he has a Shem Elokim. He limits that expression, not that he doesn't create the table, or that his expression is not within the table. The limitation is that we do not experience the table to be this divine expression. In other words, what is the limitation of Shem Elokim? The limitation of Shem Elokim is that in what Shem Havaya creates, we only experience the result of the act of creation. Right? We only experience the result. God creates the table something from nothing. We don't experience the act of his constant creation.
We see the something.
We only see the something that he created. And here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. The whole point of chapters 1 through 3 is that there is no result separate from the act of God's creation. There is no result. There is no act of creating the table, something from nothing, and then the table which is created. The entire reality of the table is the act of creating it, something from nothing. The divine speech is the reality of the table. That's all the table is. Right? There is no result. So what is Shem Elokim really doing? Shem Elokim makes that there should be a result. At least in perception, at least in how we see it, in our perception of reality, right? Which is not to say it's an illusion. That's not what I mean. It's a real thing that he does, but the real thing that he does, the real concealment that he does, is a concealment in what sense? In the sense of perception, in the way the thing is experienced. So the table has no true identity separate from the process that creates it. There is only God speaking the table into existence. That is all that is actually here. What does Shem Elokim do? Shem Elokim separates the process of creating the table, the act, I don't want to say process because it's not a process, as we said before, the act of creating the table from the result. It makes that there is such a thing as the result of the process. It makes the appearance that there is something that is created. It separates, in our experience, although not in reality, the creator with his act of creation from the creation itself. Shem Elokim does nothing less, in other words, than make a creation. Which is why the first verse of the Torah says, Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Elokim created. God is Elokim. Why is Elokim the creator? Because the entire idea that there is such a thing as a creation is an effect of Shem Elokim. Again, the entire idea that there is such a thing as a creation is the effect of Shem Elokim. Not the act of creating. The act of creating, where God speaks things into existence from nothing, is a Shem Havaya, as we said before, right? Is his expression, his constant kindness, bringing things into existence from nothing. What does Elokim do? It makes the thing that is created into a thing, as opposed to the actual act that is creating it. If you follow.
Just by having the name?
But I'm saying, no, not by having the name. It's an act. So the names describe acts of Hashem, things that Hashem is doing. Shem Havaya describes his constant speaking of the thing into existence. Shem Elokim describes his ability to restrain that. What is the restraint, though? Not that he does not create it constantly with his speech. The restraint is that it appears to the thing that is created that it is a creation, and not the constant speech of God.
It's independent.
But
Yeah.
each name would define different abilities?
Different actions. At the moment, we're just calling them actions of God, different things that God does. What these actually are, and spheres, and all the different things, we'll get to later. We'll get to that. Right now, we're describing very simply, and it's actually beautiful that the Alter Rebbe does it this way, because it allows us to not get so complicated that we totally lose track of what's happening. He's just saying the names describe God in two different capacities, right? Like I would call you an engineer and a father, even though you're only one person, right? Because you do different things, you wear different hats, so to speak, right? Depending on what you do and what ways you function, or you are perceived to function even, you have different titles. So Havai and Elokim, for now, it's like a title, right? Different actions of God. The actions are one with God, as we've said already, which is why you can't understand them. But the point is that they are actions of God. So one thing God does is he is creating everything, something from nothing. Another thing he is doing is he is making the creation appear and perceive itself and its self-perception as independent. You see the table and not the act which creates the table. You don't see the Shem Havai.
But what you're saying is that God is dependent on time.
Not at all. Not even close. Why?
Why? Because now take the table. You've got to have the table grow, the tree grow.
No.
You've got to cut it down, then shape it. So that's all part of it.
No. We're talking about the creation. No.
Why?
That's a fair question. The real question you're asking is not that. The real question you're asking does not the godly expression mean that he is involved within the limitations of the thing that he is creating, which is one of the most classic questions of the Kabbalah, and we are not answering tonight in any way. But it's a good question.
He created men as an adult.
Use a west wind
He didn't wait
to
till
separate the water.
Yeah, this.
Then Alter Rebbe goes further. The Alter Rebbe says like this. He says, 2 lines from the bottom of 864, he says, Sha'achayos mistater beguf hanivra. What does Shem Elokim do? It makes that the life force, the divine life force, is concealed within the body of the creation, right? In other words, we look at the table and we do not see God as he created, the godliness that is creating it. And it is as if the body of the creation is something which is totally separate. Rabbi Yoel actually notes that these are two different levels. These are two different levels in the concealment. The concealment actually does two things. Shem Havaya does one thing in our explanation of this chapter so far. Shem Havaya does one thing. Shem Havaya creates everything from something to nothing constantly. Shem Elokim does two things, two-step process. The first is he prevents the creation from experiencing Shem Havaya. And the second thing is he makes the creation appear independent. There's actually two separate things, right? These correspond, for those who remember, and I'll mention it even for those who don't. These correspond to what we said in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, chapter 3, we talked about the ray of the sun in the sun, right? And as you'll recall, there are two different things. There was the light as it's within the sun, and there's the light as it's outside of the sun. And we said that the reality of our world is that the light is within the sun, but the way we perceive it is that the light is outside of the sun. Right? In other words, we perceive that the divine light, that the words that God is speaking to bring the creation into existence, and the creation are actually separate things. They're separable things, as opposed to the light in the sun, which is inseparable. Right? So in other words, we perceive the world like light outside of the sun. And Rabbi Yoel notes that the Alter Rebbe here is saying that it's not even like light outside of the sun. It's like a truly independent being, right? Because light is not truly independent, right? In other words, what he's saying is like this: Shem Elokim has to do two things, right? If you conceal Shem Havaya, if you conceal the divine life source of the table, what should you see? you should see, it's a little weird because it shouldn't really be possible, so it's hard to get your mind around it. But what should be perceived? What should be perceived then is a ray of light. In other words, I don't see the divine speech of God creating the table. But when I see the table itself, what should I see? That it is an expression of the divine life source, right? It's a ray, it's a glimmer, it's an expression. When we look at the table, we don't even see it as an expression at all. So Shem Elokim really does two things. Number one, it hides the divine life source, which is constantly speaking the table into existence, and from which the table has no independent reality whatsoever. And it also makes that the table which is left over, the thing that we can actually see, the result of this process, does not even seem like a result of a process. Right? We see the table and we just see the table. We don't see something that has that demand that points to having been created something from nothing. We just see an object which appears to have an independent reality to itself. Yeah. So Shem Elokim does two things. It hides the source, and it hides the act. There's the act which produces the result. Shem Elokim hides the act and leaves over only the result. And also, God makes that the result does not even look like a result. It just looks like something that is. There's two steps of Shem Elokim's concealment. The Enoi, which is why he goes on to say here at the bottom of 864, is it hot in here to anyone else? The Enoi, if you want, I don't know if it's cool outside, so I don't know if it'll even turn on. The Enoi hispashtos, right? He says at the bottom of 864. The Enoi hispashtos achayis varuchnias hispashtos aziva me'ashemesh. The godly life force and the spiritual life is not perceived in the physical reality as an extension, as a ray or a light of the sun. Elohu davar bivnei atzmai. Rather, it appears like an independent reality. The af shebe'emes, says the Alter Rebbe, even though in truth, einoi davar bivnei atzmai, even though in truth, the table is absolutely one with the divine life source which is speaking it into existence. It is like the ray of light from the sun. Nevertheless, this itself is the restraint of God, God's self-restraint, His self-control. Asher kol yachol, which He is able to do, that God is omnipotent, and what does His omnipotence allow Him to do? To contract the life and the spirituality which He gives over from the breath of His mouth, to conceal it, that the created body, the created earthly body, should not be nullified in its existence. In other words, that it should not be perceived as totally and utterly one with God and possessing no independent reality whatsoever. V'zeh, says the Alter Rebbe, top of 866. The pages turn weird on these copies, I apologize. V'zeh en b'seichel shum nivra lahasig musa tzimtzum v'hester. It is beyond the intellect of any creation to understand this concealment and this contraction of God. That there should be, nevertheless, a created body, created something from nothing. Just as there is no creation's mind can grasp the creation something from nothing itself. So the Alter Rebbe is saying that this act of divine concealment is not understandable by human intellect, just as the creation something from nothing is not understandable. Right? So this is basically the answer to the question. This is the answer to the question he asked at the end of chapter 3. How can it be that when we look at the table, and the table is totally one in every way with the divine life source, the breath of God's mouth, which is creating it at every moment something from nothing, how can it be that we don't see this divine life force if it and the table are absolutely one? And the answer is that there is a Shem Elokim. God himself is doing it. There is a God, just as God creates the table constantly, and the table is united with this divine life source, so too is that divine life source concealed from the creation, and the creation appears independent from God. So in truth, the creation is totally one with him, but Shem Elokim makes the perception, the self-perception of the creation be that it is independent from God. And this is his gvura. And Alter Rebbe finishes by saying that his gvura, his severity, his self-restraint is just as inexplicable, just as beyond human understanding as the act of creating something from nothing itself. And the question is, why? The question is why?
Free choice.
No, that's not what I mean by why. Not why would God do this. That's still beyond our pay grade. That's still beyond our pay grade. That's not what I mean by why. I mean why on a particular point. Why is it that the concealment of his expression, that his self-restraint is as beyond human comprehension as the creation something from nothing, right? Let's think back to what we were saying before, with all the different levels, right? Nature, miracle, and that which is beyond any understanding. We're saying that his self-restraint is just as inexplicable. And there's a reason the Alter Rebbe keeps saying it. In other words, that seems fundamental to the Alter Rebbe's explanation of the concept of tzimtzum. That number one, you cannot understand creation something from nothing. And number two, just as you cannot understand something from creation something from nothing, so too you cannot understand the tzimtzum, the restraint, right? And the thing is, though, that creation something from nothing we don't have in our reality at all. But the restraint of expression, we do all the time, hopefully. We restrain our own expression sometimes, hopefully, right? But in general, like I said before, you have light that's coming through. You have light that's coming through a window or an aperture. You make the aperture smaller. Is this not tzimtzum? There's nothing as fancy as creating something from nothing, right? You withhold the light. You withhold the expression, right? You have a curtain. The curtain diminishes the light, right? What's so incomprehensible about the tzimtzum? Asks Rabbi Yoel. And the answer is that if you understand what he's really saying, the tzimtzum is, you understand exactly, it's beautiful. It's like a mirror image. It's exactly like creation something from nothing. It is just as inexplicable. How so? How so? Because when we have a tzimtzum in our world, for example, you have light coming through the window and you pull the curtain over it, or you have a lampshade, or you close the camera aperture, right? The reason why you have less light in the camera when you make the aperture smaller is because there is less light in the camera, right? In other words, in a human tzimtzum, the way to get less of something is to make less of the thing.
Less quantity.
Quantity, quality, right? Quality in light, you could say, is quantity. So quality is something about light, right? The gauze is really not as diminishing quality per se. It's just reducing the quantity in small amounts all over, which is why it appears like a quality, right? If you understand what I mean, never mind. The point is that to make less light here, you take the light away. Is that what we're talking about with the tzimtzum? Emphatically not what we're saying with the tzimtzum. If the godly tzimtzum were like the tzimtzum we know in our world, what would that mean? It would mean Shem Havaya is not present, right? Shem Havaya, God creating something from nothing, wouldn't be here, right? We are saying that is emphatically not the case. That's not what happens. Right? God creating something from nothing is here. Not only is it here, it's all that's here. Right? There is nothing else. Right? When you say Elokim conceals Shem Havaya, in what way does it conceal it? Everything is literally an expression of Shem Havaya. How concealed can it be? It's not like keeping the light out of a room. Right? If the light were kept out of the room, the thing literally wouldn't be here. That's the whole point of chapter 3. The whole point of chapter 3 that we learned is that if we were actually keeping the light out of the room of this world, so to speak, the table would literally not be here. And since it is here, that means the light is here too. There is no separating the two of them. right? It's not like a ray of the light of the sun which can leave the sun and go somewhere else on its own, right? If the table is here, the divine word that is creating the table is also here. The whole world is subsumed in Shem Havaya. All it is a way of Shem Havaya being. It's not its own independent reality at all. So when we say God is making Shem Elokim, when we say that He is concealing, reducing the light, He is not making Shem Havaya less present, right? What He is doing is He is making the fact that it is here be that it is not here. Again, He is making the fact that He is creating everything from nothing. That thing itself, the table is the act of God creating the table, something from nothing. That's all the table is. And what does He make that thing be? He makes it be a total lack of experience of God.
So what's the difference between Shem Elokim Enei Basar? It's the other side of the equation.
Not yet. Enei Basar is later. Probably only next week. We'll get back to Enei Basar. Not yet. Next week, God willing. At least you're back in the country. At least you're back in the country. At least you're back in the country. Yeah, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Your Enei Basar are bigger than your stomach.
Restricts us from seeing it.
Yeah, one second. Well, maybe at the end. Okay. So what is He doing? The table is only a godly expression. His infinite expression of His ability to create something from nothing is all that the table is. Shem Elokim makes that should present as a total concealment of God. The experience of the table is a total concealment of God. It appears to be a separate being. In other words, just as Shem Havaya is beyond understanding, and it's beyond understanding in a way that it's one with God. It is a contradiction. In other words, it is beyond the mind's ability to grasp. It is not an idea. So too, the tzimtzum is a contradiction. It is beyond the mind's ability to grasp. It is not an idea. It is a thing and its opposite, right? The tzimtzum separates a thing from itself, right? It's the exact same thing as Havaya, right? It's Havaya. When God creates something from nothing, right? When God creates something from nothing, He doesn't make something by putting something there, right? He is taking the nothing and constantly making it into something, right? It's not the worldly way of creation. The worldly way the worldly way of kindness, if I want to be kind to someone, right, is I see a beggar on the street and I give him money, right? The godly way of being kindness is that there is no beggar and I make there be a beggar, right? He takes a nothing and He makes it into a something. He adds without adding. It's not that He has made there be a beggar here, because there is no reality that He's made there be a world here, because the world has no reality separate from Shem Havaya, as we said in earlier chapters, right? The world literally has no independent reality. So when we say Shem Havaya creates something from nothing, it's really a contradiction. Right? He is not making something be here in the way that we make something be here in our world. That the thing has an independent reality and it's actually here. He is constantly making nothing into something. But what is the something? The something retains the nature of nothing. The something has no independent reality even whatsoever, right? Or as we put it in the earlier chapter, that without God there is no world, but with God there also is no world. Right? When God the act of creating the world is nothing other than just an expression of God. The world has no independent reality of God. Shem Havaya is a contradiction. The true reality of the something that He creates is nothing. He somethings without He makes something without something. He makes a something that is really nothing. Yes? So to Elokim is taking away something without taking away something. Right? Shem Elokim takes the table away from us entirely. The table is literally not here. Why is the table not here? Because the table's very identity is the godly word shulchan that is speaking it into existence constantly. Shem Elokim takes away that identity. There should be nothing left over. And yet, the table is here. That's why Shem Elokim is beyond understanding. It's a contradiction. It separates a thing from itself. It's not separating the table from its source, because the table is its source, right? That's what I was telling you before. Shem Elokim is the idea that there can be a separation. How can there be a separation? How can you separate this divine source of the table from the table itself? There cannot be a separation. It's the same thing. Hainu hach. How can you say that A is not A? X is not X, right? Algebraically, I'm saying. That is what Shem Elokim is doing. It's separating the very identity of the table from itself. It's dividing where there is no division possible. It leaves over the result of a process which has no result, which is just a process, right? There's many different ways of saying it. So really, it's a contradiction. It is only possible by the infinite power of God. It is not something that you can understand. So just as creation, something from nothing, is truly beyond understanding and beyond fathoming and truly knowing, so too is his tzimtzum, his prevention of that creation. Because just as the creation, something from nothing, is a contradiction, so too is the tzimtzum. The creation is making something be without making something be. The tzimtzum is preventing something from being without preventing it from being. Yes, it's a contradiction. They're not understandable, and they're not understandable in exactly the same way. Which is why the Alter Rebbe spends so long making this point. Because the whole idea is you're supposed to understand that even though the Tzimtzum is answering the question from chapter 3, even though the Tzimtzum is explaining why it is that we see a table and not the divine life force that creates the table, he doesn't want us to make the mistake of thinking that this means God is any less present, right? The whole thing is a mystery. It's not that God is less present. It's not that Shem Havaya is less here. Shem Havaya after the Tzimtzum is as much here in the table as it is before the Tzimtzum. Right? As before the contraction and the concealment and his hiding this reality from us. If Shem Havaya weren't here, the table wouldn't be here. And yet, Shem Elokim makes it seem that the Shem Havaya is not here, and yet the table is. Right? And it's a profound mystery, is what we're saying.
There's no creature
that
could come to understanding of what it is.
Yes.
So how do we even try to explain it?
Are we really trying? Are we really? How successful am I being?
No, but that's what it says.
We're not explaining.
It says.
We're not explaining.
When Mashiach comes, we'll be able to see this process.
I don't know. Yeah. It depends what seeing means, I guess.
So
You can see godliness in everything.
It's an idea, but it's not an idea. It's what I'm saying is it's abstract. It's an abstract thing. It's an abstract thing, right? Where all I'm trying to do is explain how far beyond understanding it is. That's really as close as we can get, and that's what Alter Rebbe is saying.
It's like getting from 1 to infinity. Even if you go 1 million miles, still you're not getting close.
The point of what the Alter Rebbe is saying is not to understand the actual process. What the actual act of the tzimtzum, or the act of creating something from nothing. That's not the point of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. What the Alter Rebbe is telling us is he's telling us about what God does in the best way that he can. Right? In other words, the tzimtzum here is not. Here's the point: we're not just like darshaning Kabbalah. We're not just saying, and this is an aspect of God, and this is an aspect of God. We're answering a very specific question, right? We explained in chapter 2 that if you understand that the world has created something from nothing, the only logical conclusion you can come to, more or less, with all the wrinkles in chapter 2, but the only conclusion that you can come to is that the world is constantly being created by God. In chapter 3 we explained that if the world is constantly being created by God, the world's reality now has no separation from the godly power which creates it whatsoever. That's what we explained in chapter 3. Chapter 4, when we're here talking about Tzimtzum, even though we're saying this is an act we can't understand, right, just as we couldn't understand the fact that he creates it something from nothing, which we also can't understand, we're saying we need to understand why we can't see him then. At a very logical level. In other words, We are in a position to ask this question. Why can't we see the process of creating something from nothing? Why can't we see the godliness? Maybe I couldn't understand it, but maybe there should be some sort of perception. The divine word shulchan, right? I should be able to see the source. Even if I can't see how the source makes the table, I should be able to see the source. And the Alter Rebbe comes and answers that the reason why you can't see it is not because it's not here. It's because God is actively in a process that you also cannot understand, making you not see it, right? I just want to add here, at the end, that this is not, people misunderstand when they learn Chassidus. We are saying something much more profound than God makes an illusion for the human perspective that it appears that the table is independent of the godly power that creates it. We're saying something much more profound than this. We're not saying that God makes an illusion for our benefit. We are saying that there are two godly opinions on the matter. God himself relates to the world in two different ways. There is a Shem Havaya way, and there is a Shem Elokim way. From the Shem Havaya way, when God is creating the world something from nothing, in the Shem Havaya aspect of God's action, the world is absolutely one with that reality. From the Shem Elokim perspective, which is a divine name, and is as much one with him as Shem Havaya. In other words, he is doing this is as true as Shem Havaya. What is he doing? He separates the result of the process of creation from the result of the act of Shem Havaya from Shem Havaya, and he makes it into a reality that recognizes itself as independent from God, in which the act of Shem Havaya is concealed. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is that this is not an illusion. This is not an illusion. It's not that the table only appears to be here, but it's not really here. The table is really here. In what way is it really here? Meaning to say separate from Shem Havaya. Meaning when I say really here, I mean really here in the physical sense, in the lowliest physical sense, as an independent reality, it's really here. In what sense is it really here? Because of Shem Elokim. Mitzad Shem Elokim. From by dint of Shem Elokim, the table is actually here. All we're saying is that does not mean that it's not also here in the way of Shem Havaya, that Shem Havaya is also one with the table, right? In other words, they're both true. They're both true at the same time, right? Relating to different godly powers. This is the mature way. This is the mature way of understanding this, right? The immature way is to say that God created an illusion that man can't see God within the table. The mature way is that the table is both an expression of God's infinite kindness and power of creation at every moment, and a concealment of that expression at the same time. That is the mature way of understanding this. And God relates to the table in both ways. God is a relation to the table through Shem Havaya, and God is a relationship to the table through Shem Elokim. So why don't we see the Shem Havaya? Because we see the Shem Elokim. Our world is created through Shem Elokim, and we see things in a Shem Elokim way. From the godly perspective, he relates to the table in both ways, equally. Yes, and both of them are equally unfathomable to the human intellect.